Hello, everybody. I don't want to take up too much time with this, but I'm an assistant director with the Stockdale Center. My favorite job there, I've been there since '06. I love this place. My favorite job is I coach a team of midshipmen that take part in ethics debate competitions. Business ethics, medical ethics, you name it. And there's one national competition that's been going on, boy, I hope I'm right about this, since about 1993. And it's called Ethics Bowl. It's a two-tiered competition. They have regionals during the fall, November and December. And those regionals involve about 150 schools nationwide. At the end of that process, 36 are chosen to go to nationals. This year, nationals were in Portland, Oregon. And I'm happy to say, after many years of being what we finally referred to as the mighty fighting betas, because we always seem to come in second place, or third, or fourth, we won the nationals this year. So I would like to say I had something to do with that, but that would be inaccurate. If anybody knows who Jim Lee Howell was, he was the head coach of the New York Giants in the late 50s. He said he had the easiest job in the world because he had as his offensive coordinator Vince Lombardi. His defensive coordinator was Tom Landry. And he said, all I really have to do is pump up the balls and make sure the guys get water. Easiest job in the world. So I feel that same way about my team. Now, I see one member here left. Everybody had to go to class, you know, being good, honorable students, they had to go to class. Washington Ross is one of my team members here. Stand up, Washington. And I'd just like to say, you know, dealing with this group year in and year out, there's every reason to be optimistic about this country. People were talking about this, our first two speakers. And being at a service academy is a special experience for an educator. And the sense of mission the place has, I think, is something that the country needs to consider and seriously implement in some way or another. And I'm very honored to coach this group. Thank you. All right, you bet. And thanks, Ed, for allowing me to do this.
And Dr. Henrik Seiss, the floor is all yours.
Officers, midshipmen, ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked to moderate this panel, and since I do believe in the virtue of moderation, I said yes. It's not up there, but it's the same one as temperance, one of those things we have to teach our students. Great honor, great pleasure. This panel is called Philosophical Perspectives. Not only that, it's called Philosophical Perspectives 1. So maybe it's the most important once we'll get there. What does it mean with a perspective? Well, it means to see things from a certain place, maybe a place you haven't been before. I love the quote from Bill Anders, who was on the first trip ever to the moon, and who took that famous picture, Earthrise. And he said when he came back that they sent us to the moon in order to explore the moon, but what we really discovered was our own planet. And that's what every one of those who were out there said. When you see it from that perspective, you see things differently. So what we are going to do is to listen to philosophical perspectives from three eminent academics up here. My job is to keep the time. They have 15 minutes each, and two of them have said, oh, mine is way longer. And the thing is, I get the blame if we go over. So help me. After 15 minutes, start yawning or something, and they'll understand. However, you won't be yawning because these are excellent academics who will share important things with us. I'll just introduce them very briefly, and we'll go in the order of the program. Christian Little is the A.C. Reid Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University, where he's taught for many years. He is currently director of the Honesty Project, funded by a large grant from the John Templeton Foundation. I'm sure you wish it had been larger, but... And his latest book is Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. So what you'll hear from him is the truth. After him will come Edward Brooks. Edward Brooks is the Executive Director of the Oxford Character Project at the University of Oxford. His research lies at the intersection of virtue ethics, character education, and leadership development, and does really interesting interdisciplinary work at Oxford. And then William Cochran, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. Look out for slingshots, according to David Brooks, where he co-leads the Embedded Ethics Teaching Lab, an interdisciplinary collaboration between philosophers and computer scientists. Those of us who remember back to the excellent program last year on artificial intelligence will know there are many questions here to be explored. And he conducts research on both ancient Greek philosophy and the ethics of emerging technologies. So it's my great pleasure to introduce all of these three gentlemen. First of all, Christian, please.
All right. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yes, good. Good morning. Oh, come on. I know I'm not General Mattis. I'm not David Brooks. Come on. Good morning. Okay, that's a little better. There we go. So it's wonderful to be here with you. I'm also not those first two speakers, so thanks for sticking around, and hopefully this will be a good discussion from a philosophical perspective of similar ideas, picking up on similar themes that you've already heard about virtue and character. So I was asked to talk about this book that I wrote called The Character Gap and summarize it in 15 minutes, and I thought, wow, that's impossible. So maybe if I can get like 17 minutes or 18 minutes, we'll see how it goes. Maybe not. I'll try my best. We'll maybe just have to stop at some point. So the goal is to cover a lot of the same ground that I did in this book with this overview. So what is good character? How good is our character? What are some secular strategies for developing a better character? And how about some religious strategies too? Pretty ambitious, and I'll dive right into it and speak quite quickly, perhaps. So here's what I'm going to be assuming. I'm going to be assuming a person with a good moral character is someone who has moral virtues. Maybe that's not too controversial of assumption. Similarly, with a bad moral character, we're going to have to talk about moral vices. So that's going to take me into the question of, well, what is a moral virtue? Now, we have examples of that, plenty of examples. We're up on the screen. We've been looking at them all morning long. But I mean, what is the definition? What are the standards for a moral virtue? How do you know whether you qualify or someone else qualifies as having a moral virtue or not? So I want to build up a little bit to get to an answer to this. Take an example as opposed to just giving you the abstract philosophical definition. Is one helpful action enough? What's the answer? No, thank you. You need to do more than just one helpful action to qualify as a compassionate person. What about repeated instances of the same helpful action? Is that enough? No, thank you. If you pick up drop papers once, that's nice. If you pick up a lot of drop papers, that's nice too. But that's not enough to qualify as a compassionate person in general. So how about repeated helpful actions across various helping relevant situations regardless of motivation? Is that enough? Now, you might be a little bit more quite hesitant, but what's the answer? You should be saying no. Wow, hesitation there. You should be saying no. And here you should be saying no because of the motivational part. Motivation matters to virtue as well as behavior. So you could be doing lots of helpful actions, but if you're doing them purely for self-seeking reasons, egoistic reasons, say to develop a good reputation or to advance in whatever field you're in, that's not going to cut it. That's not going to be enough. And so our repeated helpful actions across various primarily for virtuous motivating reasons, enough. Well, I'm going to leave it there for today. You could ask afterwards if you want to, if I think there's more to it, or maybe you want to add a few more requirements. But here at least is a preliminary summary. I think in general, from that example, we can kind of go more abstractly and say for any moral virtue, it's got to be leading to behavior that's morally admirable. I mean, come on. Stable over time. It can't just be a one-off. It manifests in a diverse range of situations, not just picking up the drop papers. And for good and admirable motivating reasons, at least primarily. We can allow for mixed motivation, but the primary reasons have to be morally admirable and virtuous ones. What else? Let's talk about that afterwards if you think there's more involved. But again, I've got to move pretty quickly. So that'll be good enough for this talk. How are we doing? That's the second question. How good is our character? How virtuous is our character? How do we tend to have the virtues? I'm going to take those as kind of interchangeable questions. And to answer those questions, I kind of thought about different ways to answer them. I could go to literature, I could go to religion, I could go to human history, I could go to the news today. Where I went for some answers was contemporary psychology. What is experimental research in personality psychology, social psychology, and other fields tell us about people's moral character when participants are put in situations where they have the opportunity to lie, cheat or not cheat, steal or not steal, help or not help. And my answer here is going to be the way overstated, way too bold of an answer, and it's also depressing for most of us today. Is not virtuous at all. Now, look, I want to qualify that. I think there's some nuance to that that we need to get out there. But the short and the sweet answer, or maybe not so sweet answer, is that most of us do not have moral virtues. Now, it says most is not all. There's going to be a bell curve, I think, here. You all here are going to be on one side. I'm not going to say which side. And then there's going to be other people on the other side. That was meant to be a joke. It didn't work. Okay. Moving on. I think I know which side you're on. How did I come to that conclusion? I've already told you. There's no way, though, I'm going to present all that research here today. No way I'm going to review hundreds and hundreds of studies, and you don't want me to do that unless you want to sleep for a while. So what I'm going to do is just give a quick highlight of 2 studies as representative examples and then move on to strategies for improvement. So here I'm asking for trust. Trust me that I read more than 2 studies and that there's more behind this than just what I can present in 15 minutes. Here's a famous one from 1969 having to do with the group effect or bystander effect. Suppose you come into a lab, you're told, sit down, fill out the survey. A few minutes later, someone else comes into the lab who is also told to fill out the survey. So the 2 of you are working away at it. You don't know each other. This person's a stranger. A few minutes later, the person who was in charge, who was given the instructions, has left. And in the next room, if you're one of the participants, if you listen carefully, you could hear her climb up on a chair to get a book from the top shelf. Even if you were not listening carefully, they heard a loud crash and a woman scream as the chair fell over. Oh my God, my foot, cried a representative. I can't move it. Oh, my ankle, I can't get this thing off me. What would you do? Help? Or you sit there? Well, a lot's going to depend on what the other person in the room does or doesn't do. It turns out, at least in this study, if the person in the room that's with you doesn't do anything, just keeps working on the survey, here's what happened. 7% helps. That's not a typo. Now, in the version where there was no other person in the room, it was just you by yourself, 70% helped. But in this version, where there was a non-responsive bystander, helping was minuscule. That doesn't reflect good character, in my opinion, and in particular does not reflect the virtue of compassion, and it's not isolated to this one study. There are many other variations of this kind of study, epileptic seizures, falling off a ladder, crying out in pain from an electric shock, and you can see some of the other ones on down the line, perhaps the worst one of all, that last one. So this kind of pattern is well established, and it's probably well known now in terms of the bystander effect. It's gotten out into popular culture as well. So that's one example of a kind of result that I don't find very encouraging. Here's another example, very different context, also much more recent. Here we're now looking at cheating as opposed to helping. This is a paradigm that's commonly used to experimentally assess cheating behavior. Worksheet with 20 problems, 50 cents per correct answer. Do you have tests like that here? It'd be kind of nice if you got paid for correct answers, but in this case you would. And in the control condition, you would be paid purely on the basis of your performance. You take the test, you turn it in, and it's graded based upon whether you got the answers right or wrong. However, the interesting one is the shredder condition, and here you get to grade the materials yourself. So think how that's going to go. And then you grade the material, you grade your own performance, you shred all your materials, and you just verbally report how well you did, in quotation marks. And it's clear that you can say anything you want. You say, I got a 0 out of 20, I got a 10 out of 20, I got 20 out of 20, and you'll be paid accordingly. No questions asked. So what do you think happened? Well, here's when there was a baseline. There's no opportunity to cheat. About 8 out of 20. And what's going to happen in the other group? 2 out of 20? 4 out of 20? 8 out of 20? 10 out of 20? 20 out of 20? Higher, yes. We got to think it's going to be higher. I'm already setting you up for this. I'm priming you to think that's higher. Indeed, look at what it was. Twice as high. They were really smart, weren't they? Well, maybe in one sense, but I don't think it's based on their performance on the test. So, look, that doesn't reflect well on honesty. The first one doesn't reflect well on compassion. And I don't draw any conclusions from those 2 studies. That's just 2 studies out of many. You can't make grandiose conclusions. But when I read hundreds of studies in moral psychology like these, I conclude I don't see the patterns of what? Well, what am I looking for? Patterns of behavior that need to be there for there to be evidence of virtue. I'm not seeing those patterns of behavior. And also motivation, too, which is harder to detect. But I'm not seeing either of those. So I conclude that most of us are not good people. Maybe not too surprising, but there's experimental evidence at least to back that up. And this is something I spent lots of years diving into and summarizing in these 2 earlier academic books with nice covers, my mother's artwork. Okay, that's another story for another time. So we're left with the character gap, the title of the book that's in front of you. The gap between our actual character and a virtuous character, the character we actually have and the character we should have, and I think the gap is quite large. Maybe not in this audience, but in my own case and in many people's case as well. So what do I have now left by way of time?
Let's see. You have 4 minutes and...
Oh my gosh, it just flies by.
We'll stretch it to 5.
Okay, I'll at least get into some of the secular strategy. So what are we going to do about it? If I stopped here, it'd be like, hey, here's the bad news. See you later, and have a good rest of the day. I think, though, that, and this will be picked up on by the other panelists as well, there are a number of things that can be done proactively and concretely to try and address the character gap and shrink it, raising our own characters up to the level of a virtuous character, at least not, maybe not all the way, but trying to make progress, as opposed to reducing the standards down to what our actual character is. So my goal was to present a variety of strategies, both secular and religious. Looks like maybe I'll only get to the secular ones here, and you can ask me about religious ones if you like afterwards. First one, role models, has been touched on already this morning. Here we have 2 well-known and 1 less well-known role models. The third person is Leopold Sosha, who hid 20 Jews in a sewer system for 2 years in an occupied town in Poland during World War II. Had to crawl on his hands and knees through the filthy sewer waste every day to bring food and water to those people. And so the idea here is by studying role models, they can have this kind of impact. They can inspire us to become better. Well, how more concretely would that work? They can first be the basis for admiration. We can admire them, but admire them in such a way that we have an emotional reaction to their lives, that we are moved emotionally and inspired to become more like them in the ways in which they were excellent. Not in every way. No one was flawless. That was one of the questions that came up in the last session. But at least in the ways in which they were excellent, we can be inspired to become more like them as well. And there's empirical backing for this, both in the good way and in the bad way. So negative role models can inspire negative behavior. Here, going back to the same kind of setup we had before, with the shredder condition, if you know that you share the same birthday as someone else, and you see that person cheating, that will inspire you to cheat more. Kind of weird, but it turns out to be the case. And on the flip side, in a better way here, when in the context of an emergency, where you hear the crash in the next room, and someone leads the way as acting quickly to help the stranger, that inspires much more behavior on the part of participants as well. So in this case, when the stranger did nothing versus when the stranger acted quickly, the strangers acting quickly inspired others to act well themselves. Okay, So it's empirical support, not just a blank promise here with no backing to it. Second strategy I'll mention, I've got 3 of these and then I'll stop. Let's try to educate ourselves and others as much as we can about the surprising psychological tendencies we have to do morally problematic things. I call this getting the word out. Greater self-awareness about our own moral tendencies that impede us from being virtuous people. So when we have that greater self-awareness, we can be more mindful about these tendencies and counteract them when they might come into play. We can work to compensate for, correct, or encourage them if they happen to be positive tendencies. So that's pretty abstract. Okay, I think I'll make it. Here's an illustration. Go back to the bystander effect one more time. I'm trying to tie in the earlier studies with some improvements as well. When students actually learned about the bystander effect, when they were educated about it, which they weren't familiar with before, but when they were presented with this information, as you all are, I'm sure, familiar with it already, but hearing about it now too, that mattered. So in this study, which is admittedly old and needs to be replicated, there was an emergency later on that day. 67% of students helped. What was the percentage from earlier? 7, right? 67% helps. And here, a little bit more in the control group, but still, look at the spread. Look at the difference. And then, this is maybe even more important, 2 weeks later. I mean, it's one thing to have the lecture in the morning and then have the emergency in the afternoon, but when does life ever happen like that? But 2 weeks later, still a difference. So as a professor, if my lectures had that impact, I would be thrilled. Right, professors out there? I mean, boy, that would make me really excited to hear. So that's the second one. And the last one, sustained moral reminders. So I'm assuming here that most of us know the right thing. At least intellectually, we know what is right and wrong. Typically, we know we shouldn't cheat, we shouldn't steal, we shouldn't tell these lies in typical cases. We know that. But we also have competing interests going on. Self-interest can get in the way and cloud our judgments in some cases. So what moral reminders can do very effectively is call to mind our values and make them more cognitively salient and have them function more efficaciously in our minds and in our subsequent behavior. So to round this out, go back to the honesty again and the cheating and that whole set of research with honor codes. You have an honor code here? I've talked at various places, in particular the Air Force Academy, about the honor code. I know there are lots of complicated issues about honor codes, but at least a preliminary vote in their favor. So we have the shredder set up again. Different researchers, 50 cents per correct answer, control condition again. Now notice it's a different test, so a harder test. They're only getting 3 out of 20 right on this one. Shredder condition as well, doubles the performance, in quotation, at least the reported performance. Now, here's the next one. What if the students sign their university's honor code first, then we're in the shredder condition, and then had an opportunity to report on how well they did or didn't do? Drops back down to the baseline. At least in this one study, the honor code looked like it was quite efficacious. What if we up the stakes? $2. Oh, it's more tempting now. More money's at stake. Control condition, about the same. Oh, no surprise. Shredder condition, about the same. No surprise. And honor code condition, about the same. Maybe surprising. So this has been demonstrated in other contexts, less experimentally rigorous, but the efficaciousness of honor codes here with plagiarism, unauthorized crib notes, unpermitted collaboration, all showing significant decreases when there's an honor code in place. Why do I mention the honor code? It's a form of moral reminder. It's a kind of a moral reminder that serves to make our values psychologically aware to us. They're there, latent, but that makes it aware to us, and it's very hard for us in that kind of situation to turn around and cheat. So having moral reminders in general is a third strategy, and I'm going to stop and skip that. I'm going to end. Any of these sound promising to you? And are there other promising secular approaches besides those 3? love to hear from everyone afterwards, and I've pressed the limits of my moderator, so I'm going to sit down.
Thank you so much, Christian. Excellent. Edward, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's an absolute honour to be here and to be at this incredible conference. I'm delighted to be able to share something as well of the work we've been doing at the University of Oxford, where I lead the Oxford Character Project. I'm going to talk a little bit about this question of how we move from aspiration into action. It'll be less philosophical, more practical, and actually pick up quite nicely on where Christian left us. So at the University of Oxford, in 2014, we established the Oxford Character Project, and we do some research on character, looking at virtue ethics, the intersection of virtue ethics, character development, and leadership education as well, across disciplines with a wonderful team. We take that research, and that research with empirical research as well around programs that we run, underpins student programs for graduate students in the first instance at the University of Oxford, joining together character and leadership. And we've had the privilege and opportunity as well to share some of these programs in other institutions, universities, commercial organizations, and so forth in different places, all driving towards the kind of leadership, moral leadership, the kind of leadership that drives societal impact. We want to help students to reflect on who they are, what their purpose is, what they would mean for them to live a life of consequence, what their commitment to the world will be. And we join together with different organizations as we think about how that impact or that aspiration for impact can be connected into action. And the SDGs is one framework we use as we help students to operationalize their leadership, even in their university career. The research we do kind of covers three main areas at the moment, with three different research groups working on character development in higher education, a large project at the moment coming to an end on character, culture and leadership in commercial organisations in the UK, looking at some sectors, tech, finance, law and business, and then some work on character and global leadership, and a report that's about to come out after a 6-month study with some collaborators around the world on character development and leadership in lower middle income countries as well. So that's the research with some empirical work as well, pre-post studies around the programs that we run to evaluate their effect. Aspiration. So we've been talking a lot even this morning, and there's this kind of underlying sense that we'd love to see greater character in leadership right across society. There's also a sense sometimes in the conversations around character and leadership that there's a kind of sense of embattlement that this isn't necessarily what we see all the time. I want to think about a little bit about this aspiration, how an aspiration now could be joined to action, but what is that aspiration? And I want to focus on the higher education sector because it's what I know most about. In the 19th century, there was a commitment to character education. It wasn't just in the 19th century. It had been built through higher education from its outset, and Oxford is a few hundred years old. But certainly there in the 19th century, you get a sense that education is really focused on characters. This is Lawrence Brockless and the summative history of the University of Oxford. The point of an undergraduate education was not to fill the heads of the young with practical and useful information, that could come later. Rather, it should aim to form character, which was exactly what Oxford's focused curriculum was set up to do. An education built around the difficult studies of classical literature, classical logic, ethics, and for the better students, mathematics, trained the mind, discouraged idle speculation, created solid citizens who would not abuse liberty or undermine property and could profitably turn their hand to any business of life. If you like, in the 19th century, the whole of the university was a character project. This was what the university education was there to do. If you wanted to start a new class at the university, a new program, a new course, you had to go through a board, and the kind of frame of reference was this class, is this course, as it's configured, is this curriculum going to develop character or not? And new curricula were kind of formed and shaped in that way, with that in mind. Now, we won't go into the story, but you know this didn't last through into the 20th century. This vision was tied up with various different aspects of tradition, life, and culture, with an imperial vision as well in the UK. And the First World War, that had been happening for a while, certainly post the First World War, there was quite a different sense of what Oxford education should be about, which came increasingly. There was a loss, if you like, but I want to argue that loss wasn't a loss of aspiration. Actually, it was a loss of confidence, yes, a loss of articulacy, yes, but not a loss of ambition when it comes to educating character. So right through the 20th century, education and higher education turned in a more technical direction. There were good reasons for that, and it turned away from ethics towards evidence, towards engagement, towards economics and so on. But still, in the formative, summative documents of our kind of modern liberal order, there is still a commitment, less articulate, yes, but to the aspects of education which are around character development. So here in the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, in Article 26, 2, education should be directed to the full development of the human personality, to strengthening of respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms. It's the same kind of idea. It's indicating to a broader vision for education beyond technical education, which is prevalent. Okay, well, what about as that gets developed even more recently, 2015, into the SDGs? Now here, in the middle of the SDGs built on the UN Declaration of Human Rights when it came to SDG 4 and education. And here again, it's the same thing. Look in the middle there. It's about the content of education, which should be about responsible citizenship, human rights, peace and so on, cognitive and non-cognitive aspects. Knowledge, skills, yes, but also values and attitudes. The aspiration is still there. What does this mean for higher education? How can higher education institutions educate then for this idea around values, attitudes, holistic human development? What does that mean? How does it relate to the other components of university life and university education? And what does it mean today? Well, we've done a little bit of research on university mission statements. This is historic research up here in front of you, some meta-analyses of university mission statements in recent years. And they uncover, yes, an emphasis on the core business of research, of teaching, but also on a larger, wider purpose in higher education, a purpose which is focused on society. That was the finding in analysis of 248 mission statements in 2018. Again, in 2019, 250 mission statements around the world, social responsibility, a chord I mentioned. And again, in 2020, of 227 mission statements, higher education institutions are talking about the importance of serving communities. This is what universities are saying in their public documents. Our own analysis, we looked more recently at the top universities, so top 10 plus universities in parts of the world where there wasn't a university in the top 10. And again, the same idea comes up. There's this emphasis on social purpose in every university. Universities want to make a contribution to, make a difference in, serve society. How do they take themselves to be doing that? So we pushed down even further and said, okay, well, what's the kind of education that universities are offering? What are they saying about their educational mission that serves their overall mission? And if you look at that, you find that the educational mission of universities is about developing citizens and citizen leaders. It's about developing students with a servant attitude towards society and with certain qualities of character. And this is everywhere around the world. I put 2 examples up. We could look at so many more, and I'll show you some now. But Tsinghua University, there in Beijing, cultivating citizens and leaders who will thrive in the world and become tomorrow's leaders. Harvard College, the mission is to educate citizens and citizen leaders for our society. At Oxford, we talk about values, skills, and intellectual disciplines through a commitment to the personal education of each student. That's the famous tutorial system that we have. We will provide a quality of education and experience which equips students with the values, skills, and intellectual discipline that will enable them to make a positive contribution to society. Values and attitudes. Some are speaking very explicitly about character. It's surprising perhaps where you see this. This is MIT's mission statement, and it's recent. This was updated just last year. But have a look at this. Yes, it's a technical education, but as well to provide a liberal as well as a professional education so that each student acquires a respect for moral values, a sense of the duties of citizenship, and the basic human understanding and knowledge required for leadership, and thereby to send forth men and women of the highest professional competence with both the learning and the character to deal constructively with the issues and opportunities of our time. So they've got these 3 aspects. They've got knowledge, competence, and character. These 2 aspects, professional education, yes, liberal education aims towards breadth of learning, that's the knowledge part, professional competence, that's the skills part, and character, and this is particularly important because of the times in which we live. So the aspiration still is there, and yet, and it's here as well, here at the Academy, of course, and whatever institution you're from, you will have your own mission statement, and I think it'll express many of these same ideas. But you go to administrators in these universities. I've done this quite a lot of times now. I go to new universities and talk to administrators. I say, this is fantastic. I've noticed you have this aspiration in your mission of your university. I'd love to hear how you're finding it as you're trying to do this in the university. It's there written really large. How are you going with this piece about educating character? And people will scratch their head. Often they will point to a specific scholarship program or a class that's taking place or one course that's offered for some students. Even if it's a large course, it's a minority of the students. And this is the case as well in Oxford. That there's not widespread education in values and attitudes, even though it's there, central to our educational mission. So we have the aspiration, we're not sure quite how to do it. It's difficult. Institutions are plural. People come from all kinds of different backgrounds and perspectives. Character education historically has been heavily traditioned. So how do you take and educate character for students in plural contexts? We're not sure about moral education. Can a character be developed? And we're puzzled about that. And academics are. Academics are in their academic silos. They're focused, and their incentive structures are all within those silos. They're not trained to educate for character within their curricula, as they might do. So universities aren't sure how to do it. How can we move from aspiration to action? Well, 4 principles, 2 minutes to go. Okay, 4 principles that we have: aspirational, not remedial; dialogical, not didactic; relational, not transactional; transformative, not additive. The binary is artificial. Of course, it's to make a point, but how can this educational work? The first point is what we've heard already this morning about helping students to think about the kinds of lives they would like to live, the kinds of people they would like to become. There's an aspirational quality to character education, which we can miss if we just focus on the crisis. Sure, that's there, and there's a backstory to every character project. Ours is the financial crash, and whether Oxford students do anything different to any others. But if we go to Oxford students and say, well, we're not sure that your character is up to scratch these days, they're going to run a mile. But if we invite them to come and talk about the kinds of leaders they'd like to be in the world, then we've got a conversation, and we're talking about the same thing, and the discussion is off and running. So it's aspirational, the approach that we take, then it's discursive and dialogical, Socratic in the approach, relational because it's about role modeling, it's about personal aspects of education. It can't be about simply a program which transfers. And it's transformative. The ambition is not for another part, a box that can be added to curricula in higher education institutions, but something that flows across curricular programs, extracurricular, personal interactions around all aspects of campus life. Here we go. I will jump the theory and I'll go straight to the pedagogy then. So how do we do this? And this is Christian's 3 plus some others as well. So one thing we did earlier on was to think about, okay, well, how do we build up some theory behind character education in universities and take the critical project forward? So we've done that, answered some objections and thought about what this means with the kind of neo-Aristotelian approach, and then drew together from classical and contemporary work empirically supported strategies which we might apply in curricula. And there are 7, and they're there up on the board, and we can put these together into a nice model which we can share with students, but most of all integrate through the programs that we run. And they start with this principle of habituation through practice. Character virtues are habits, and they're developed by enacting those habits. This is ancient Aristotle. We become courageous by doing courageous things. We become compassionate by acting in compassionate ways. The same thing time and time and time again. That builds up the character quality, the virtue which is then applicable across different aspects of life, developed through practice. Role models, we become like those we look up to, but as our admiration is reflective. So we help students to think about how they can learn from role models. We don't just put role models in front of them, but we help them to go through a reflective process of being people who could learn from others and who are good at learning from others in relevant ways. Reflection. How can we learn from our experience? Only by habits and practices of reflection, and we help students to develop those. Language. Moral articulacy has fallen away. We need to build up language, because language is the way we grasp aspects of reality in the world, and so we help students and develop a moral vocabulary. Systems. This is the biases that are there, institutional biases that make different norms prevalent in different ways, getting the word out as a strategy to navigate that. Just awareness of the incentive structures that are going on and around us that we live within, but also then, as a leader, thinking about how you can design institutions in ways, design contexts in ways, opt in and opt out of certain situations and settings in order to navigate those different systemic precious. Reminders can help us to keep norms salient and before us and can be developed intentionally. And friendships, not simply of the, if you think of the three Aristotelian types, not simply friends of pleasure, they're important and we can enjoy activities of sport and leisure and so on, or friends of kind of practical friends of instrumental friendships, where there's a kind of networking sense and an instrumental gain, but deeper friendships of mutual accountability. I'm going to pause there. The practice actually is very straightforward. It looks very mundane, but it's very intentional. It's very intentional, and that's the thing, thinking that, okay, we've got this context. This is an extracurricular activity we're running. This is a class, a curriculum. How is this class or curriculum integrating each of these strategies, or which of them, throughout the different program? This is an example of a sheet from a leadership program that we run, just showing step by step how we've thought through how these different strategies then get implemented, integrated into the program. And I think that's what it comes down to move from aspiration to action. It's all in the detail. It's all in the detail. How can we perhaps do that better together? Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear how both Brookses ended by talking about friendship. So we hand on to our friend William the podium now, please.
Excuse me, getting over a bit of a cold. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here and to speak to the United States Naval Academy midshipmen in particular, and midshipmen and women, and to be on this distinguished panel. For my 15 minutes, or what I hope will be 15 minutes, I'll try to stick to time. I want to go back to some of the very first thinkers who talked about moral character and to recover their philosophical perspective on moral development. I don't want to try to go back to the past merely, but to try to learn from these thinkers and see what we can recover and carry forward. So I'm going to begin in good philosophical fashion by presenting a challenge to one of the assumptions of a conference on character development, that it's even possible to develop virtue. The challenge isn't original to me, however. It actually comes from Plato's Meno. Then I'm going to show, I hope, how Aristotle takes up this challenge in his Nicomachean Ethics. And I'm going to present a sketch of an Aristotelian model of moral development. David Brooks talked about the 4 different models of character formation. I'm going to present a 5th, which was perhaps the first. That's Aristotle's. So finally, I'm going to conclude with a brief reflection on how all of this ancient Greek philosophy can offer guidance for us, and in particular for those of you in the military today. So first, the challenge from Plato's Meno. The Meno is a dialogue written by Plato sometime in the 4th century BC, which goes to show you how long such issues have been discussed and debated. It's nearly 2,400 years. In this particular dialogue, Socrates has a discussion with a young aristocratic man named Meno, who we know from historical accounts was a real person and, according to the dramatic setting of the dialogue, is about to set off on what will be a disastrous military campaign into Persia. Xenophon relates that the troops under Meno's command won't stay in line or follow his lead, and they descend into debaucherous behavior, and several get lost or killed. So perhaps it's fitting that at the beginning of the dialogue that bears his name, Meno asks Socrates whether virtue can be taught. He says, "Can you tell me, Socrates, can virtue be taught? Or is it not teachable, but the result of practice? Or is it neither of these, but men possess it by nature or in some other way?" What we see here is a focus on the question of how virtue is developed. We've got some options up here in red as well. In characteristic fashion, however, Socrates doesn't want to answer this question. First, he says, it's necessary to inquire with Meno into the nature of virtue itself. We need to understand what virtue is before engaging in a discussion of how it comes to be. Although their efforts to define virtue are unsuccessful, Socrates and Meno press on anyway, under the assumption that if virtue is knowledge, then it can be taught. And if it's not knowledge, then it can't be. And there's an underlying assumption that runs throughout the whole dialogue and is unchallenged, that something can be taught if and only if it's knowledge. But during the ensuing discussion, an argument is made that virtue probably isn't knowledge because there are no teachers of virtue. In medicine, we have people skilled in healing the body, and they can successfully and reliably impart their skill to medical students. So too in carpentry or even gymnastics. But what about in virtue? To explore this question, and I'll support his argument here, Socrates highlights men like Themistocles and Pericles, some of the greatest military generals and statesmen of ancient Athens. If anyone is capable of teaching virtue, he posits, it's going to be these men, because, as everybody readily recognizes and agrees, if anyone possesses the virtue that they would impart to others, it's them. Moreover, if there was anyone to whom they would be motivated to impart this virtue, it would be their sons. And yet, as the record shows, the sons of these great men did not turn out to be so great themselves. None of them came to be distinguished for virtue and honor like their fathers. So, Socrates concludes, virtue seems not to be teachable after all, because even in these most favorable conditions, where these great men possess the virtue that they would teach and they have a strong motivation to teach it, virtue was still unable to be taught. By the end of the dialogue, the best that Socrates and Meno are able to do with regard to their initial question is conclude that virtue is dispensed to individuals by the divine. Why? Because they also come to the conclusion that while virtue may not be knowledge, it could still be true belief. For like knowledge, someone with true belief can offer correct guidance in practical matters, and so it allows statesmen and generals to give sound advice about what to do. Yet it is not something that is taught, for again, only knowledge is taught. So of the options on the table then, teaching, practice, nature, or something else, the only possibility that Socrates and Meno can see for how such true belief comes to be for individuals is by divine luck. And so the dialogue ends with this implication that there's nothing we can really do to develop moral character except pray. But perhaps there's something to this idea that virtue is true belief, because at least true beliefs offer correct guidance about what to do. The problem with true beliefs, however, according to Socrates, is that they are unstable. Socrates uses an analogy or an image to explicate his thinking here. True beliefs, he says, are like the statues of Daedalus. Daedalus, depicted here as the man sitting down, was a famous sculptor whose statues could reportedly move around on their own, a kind of proto-artificial intelligence, if you will. Or they were so lifelike that they looked like they might get up and walk away. But in any case, these statues were considered very beautiful and so very valuable to possess, yet they proved difficult to hold on to. If you wanted to keep one, it was said that you had to tie it down or else it could run off. True beliefs behave similarly, according to Socrates. They're valuable so long as you hold on to them, but in order to hold on to them, you have to find some way to tie them down in the soul. And the way to do this, he says, is with an account of the reason why. So Socrates, frustratingly perhaps, doesn't explain himself much further in this dialogue, but the idea seems to be this. If we believe if we believe only that something is the case, even if our belief is true, this belief is susceptible to wandering off and departing our souls. Knowledge, however, is not going to be like that, because it combines a true belief with an account of the reason why that belief is true. Having the reason why something is the case ties the belief down in our souls and makes it remain steadfast therein. Just as a side note, the word meno comes from a Greek word meno, which means to remain or to stay. And this is, I think, an instance of Plato's playful artistry at work, naming the dialogue after somebody whose name is to remain. The question, however, which Plato, again, does not have Socrates discuss, is how one gets an account of the reason why. For this, I say, we need to look to Aristotle. So Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, also takes up this question of whether virtue can be taught. Whereas the answer from the Meno is no, Aristotle's answer is much more nuanced. Aristotle begins his conceptual mapping of moral development not by proposing different methods of moral education, nor with an investigation into the nature of virtue, but with a discussion of the nature of the soul. Whereas the Meno considered the soul as a single entity, Aristotle is going to distinguish two parts. So each part of the soul, according to Aristotle, has its own corresponding type of virtue, and each type of virtue is cultivated by its own corresponding method of moral education. The intellectual virtues, such as Sophia or phronesis and practical wisdom, belong to the rational part of the soul and are both generated and developed mostly by teaching. The virtues of character, such as courage, temperance, justice, and the like, these belong to the non-rational part of the soul, at least the part that is able to listen to reason, and these are brought about by habituation. And so Aristotle's answer to the question of whether virtue can be taught is more complicated than a simple yes-no. His response is, well, partly no, for the virtues of character are not developed by teaching, but rather by habituation, but also partly yes, for the virtues of thought, these are developed by teaching. Now, habituation is a method of moral education that's received a lot of attention from scholars in the last 40 years, and it's been discussed as well today, so I won't dwell on it. But the general idea is that if you do enough courageous actions, for example, in the way a courageous person would do them, you'll eventually be able to develop the virtue of courage within yourself. But what does this habituated virtue get you? According to Aristotle, what it gets you is a reliable disposition to behave in the right ways, at the right times, and with the right motives. Elsewhere in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that such moral virtue also supplies one with the correct opinion or true belief. That is to say, it supplies the habituated moral learner with a true belief that a particular situation calls for, say, courage. Now, teaching, on the other hand, this is a topic that's been largely neglected within Aristotle scholarship, except for my dissertation, small plug. This may be because there's simply no sustained treatment of the nature of teaching in Aristotle's texts. Yet Aristotle, in scattered remarks that run throughout his corpus, repeatedly and consistently describes teaching as a specific kind of linguistic activity that aims to supply learners with explanatory accounts, with a knowledge of the what and the why of things. Teaching, in other words, to put it briefly, is about explaining things. It's about giving accounts of the reason why. So to see the role of teaching in moral development, first note that the habituated moral learner is in the same state as those who have true belief in the Meno. They can act rightly in a situation based on their true belief, and they could offer correct guidance to another person. In this situation, you should act with courage, they might say. But they couldn't explain to Socrates or another inquiring philosopher what courage really is, nor could they give a satisfactory account of why it's called for in a particular moment. Yet accounts of this sort are exactly the sort of thing that we should expect a moral learner to receive from a teacher of virtue, given what we know about the nature of teaching. And although Aristotle doesn't say this explicitly anywhere, if we look to what he does in the Nicomachean Ethics, we see an indication that he would agree with this assessment. For in the Nicomachean Ethics, it's a text that is widely thought to be connected in some way to Aristotle's own teaching. Either they were his lecture notes or the notes that his students took in his classrooms. We see Aristotle articulate accounts of what the virtues are, that's books 3 through 6, and he furnishes his readers with an ultimate explanatory principle as to why virtues are necessary, namely the role that they'll play in human flourishing, how their possession and exercise largely constitutes living an excellent life. Thank you. So Aristotle, it seems, is perhaps the teacher of virtue that we've been missing from Socrates' discussion in the Meno. Such teaching about virtue, which provides habituated moral learners with these sorts of accounts, ties down their true beliefs about virtue, which they receive through habituation, and leads, with time and experience, to the cultivation of practical wisdom, or what Aristotle calls full virtue. For when moral learners act courageously as a matter of habituated virtue, their actions are in accord with reason, Aristotle says, but this is not the same as to involve reason in the decision. Involving reason in the decision requires practical wisdom, for as Aristotle says, the correct reason about such matters is practical wisdom. And this correct reason, as I've just sketched here, is supplied by teaching, by providing accounts of the reason why. All right, so to conclude, what does all of this ancient Greek philosophy have to do with you all in this room, in the military? So I'm going to try to offer some thoughts. Though I'm an outsider, it seems to me that out of all other sectors in our society, the military does an exceptionally good job of habituating moral character. In the more typical university setting, like Harvard or others, we're usually quite good at theorizing about things. And we have to work to carve out spaces or programs where students have the opportunity and the proper setting in which they can cultivate character and leadership. But so far as I understand it, in military academies, there's already a strong emphasis on the habituation of good character. And just as a case in point, this is what I saw coming back to the campus last night. Courage is there, front and center on some of your buildings. But if we take what Plato and Aristotle have to say seriously, I think we should note that merely habituated virtues can be like those statues of Daedalus. They're valuable to have while you have them, but unless they're tied down with an account, they can easily wander off and leave your soul. Perhaps they leave you when you leave the military, or perhaps they leave you when life or bad luck throws some tragedy in your direction that forces you to question the very point of being virtuous at all. What's needed then, I suggest, following this reading of Plato and Aristotle, is the sort of teaching that Aristotle gestures towards and exemplifies in his Nicomachean Ethics, an account of what the virtues are and why they're necessary. Perhaps engaging with the Platonic dialogues also could be instructive here as well. The Lackeys, for example, is all about what courage is. The good news is that because you're in an institution that is already working on forming your character, you're in an especially prime position to actually meaningfully engage with this more theoretical endeavor, to not merely wax philosophical about the nature of the virtues, but rather to hopefully tie a more comprehensive understanding of what these virtues are to the virtues that you're forming as a part of your own character. I think this is a unique thing that the military academies are in a position to be able to do. In doing so, if Aristotle's right, you may have a shot at developing practical wisdom, which is not an easy thing to do, and you may even be able to teach others about the virtues, so that, unlike Themistocles and Pericles, you're able to teach your own sons and daughters about virtues, as well as those who serve under your command. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. Brilliant. We started the panel per se a few minutes late, so hopefully we can do 5 minutes of Q&A now, even though we realize we stand between you and lunch. So I suggest you raise your hand if you have any comments or questions for this brilliant panel. And there will be microphones around from what I understand. So please, yes, right in front here. Are there revolving microphones here now?
Unless it's essential for recording, I can...
Please, just speak loudly. Thank you.
So thank you, all of you. This is probably for Ed, but all of you could address it, certainly. So I love your framework. My question is, what happens in a setting where you have competing frameworks? For instance, you have role models. You become those who we look up to. It seems to me a little tricky because there are proper people to look up to, and there are improper people to look up to. How do I learn the right ones to look up to if I haven't yet developed the character to help you do so? So what do you do with the competing frameworks?
Thank you. That was my question too, so thank you very much. Any others who would like to jump in before we give these gentlemen a chance to round up? Yes, there are two over there and one there. So I suggest if each of you are really brief, that'll be okay. So the two of you first, then you, please.
I had one question for Dr. Miller and perhaps Dr. Brooks as well. Both of you spoke on role models, and Dr. Miller, I was interested by your inclusion of Abraham Lincoln on your slide of role models because his legacy is perhaps a little more complicated than what is often taught. So I was wondering, what is more important when we're using role models to develop character? Is it that more simplified idea that we're teaching people, or is maybe delving into someone's detailed past what we should focus on?
Thank you so much. Please.
I was hoping that you could expand on the concept of practical wisdom and how exactly that's built.
Thank you so much, and you'll have a chance to.
Simply, Dr. Brooks' model, if I'm not mistaken, had the reference citing for postgraduate studies. Is there something different or unique about undergraduate?
Wow, we have quite a list there. I'm sure this can be continued into lunch, but I'll give each of you a chance to give a brief comment to that. So I'll start with you, Christian, then Edward, and then William. Please.
Sure. Thank you so much. So speaking to the question about role models, I think, first of all, you're quite right to note that most of the role models we look to are flawed individuals. They're going to have some good sides, but some bad sides of their character. We don't want to emulate the bad sides, and we have to be very careful what we're looking at when we look at their character. But you're specifically focused on, do we kind of look at a caricature of them or the nitty-gritty of their own personal lives? I guess I would lean more towards the second. On this basis. There's empirical research supporting the idea that the more effective role models are those who are more relatable to us. And ideals and kind of caricatures are not going to be that relatable to us. They're going to be kind of distant from us. It may be hard for us to attain, and sometimes can be discouraging because they're so above us. But when we look into the nitty-gritty complexity of these people's characters, we see, oh, they're maybe not so different from us in certain ways, and I can actually relate to what they were going through and make a personal connection to them. So they're more attainable and more relatable the more we personalize them and learn about their actual character.
Thank you very much. Edward, please.
Thanks very much. So on undergraduates, no, I don't think massively different. We developed the model with postgraduate students, but have taught with undergraduate students as well. I think the differences are in experience, and so the development of reflective practice and the kind of amounts you have to work with thinking about leadership is slightly different, but no, it's transferable, I think. In terms of competing frameworks, great question. I think here, this is the part referred to as systems or institutional pressures, expectations. Characters never developed in a vacuum. They're always, characters always being developed by institutions. And so how can we develop character which is positive, good character within institutional settings where there are aspects which will lead us in different directions? I think here it depends slightly who you are asking this question. Right? Are we thinking about, okay, how can we work as a leader in an organization? How can you work to help people to develop character more propitiously? And you might think then, okay, about the levers you have in institutional design to develop institutional contexts where the frameworks are more aligned. If you're thinking about the framework as an individual, well, then you might, or as teaching individuals within organizations, you might think about how, say, on role models, okay, well, the idea of role models isn't going to help you on its own. We need to help students to think about who their role models might be and how they can develop to become like them in morally relevant ways. Now, that depends on the role of the teacher or facilitator in the question. And this Socratic approach here is all about, I think, asking then good questions, asking why. So asking students who their models are and asking why. And doing that in a group context where you can then start to work through some of these questions together. And then you're going into the how questions. Well, what would it mean to become like that person in relevant ways? How can that happen? And what are the ways in which this is working in the other direction in the context in which you're in? Which maybe relates back to the strategy on getting the word out and understanding context and the power of that too.
Thank you. William, would you like anything at the end?
Sure. I'll take the easy question of what is practical wisdom.
Yeah, good. 2 minutes.
Yeah, good. Fitting. So practical wisdom, or phronesis, it's also translated as prudence, as it is up there on the board. And you see that it's right in the middle. And it's also got this kind of halo around it, so it seems pretty important. It is important. For Aristotle, there are no other character virtues without practical wisdom. In order to have full virtue, you actually need to have both some of these moral character virtues and practical wisdom on top of that. So without those, there's a sense in which you don't even have the virtues of character. Now, what it is, that's going to take more than 2 minutes, but it is a virtue of thought, particularly of the rational part of the soul that is in charge of logically calculating or deliberating for Aristotle. It's the thing that helps you hit upon the truth with reason as about what to do in practical matters. And I'll leave it there.
That was elegant. I hope we all realize that the common denominator for all of these 3 excellent presentations is that teachers matter. Well, that's a nice thing to hear. Thank you for providing the wonderful perspectives you have. Before we leave this room, Ed will tell you about the lunch, but before that even, a big applause for our wonderful panel.
Thank you, Henrik, for that masterful moderation. And another thing in common with between the panelists is I gave them an impossible task. The only thing I can say is just read their books. Their books are very elegant and insightful, expansions of their thinking that they presented here today. So thank you for agreeing to those conditions. So all this wisdom has made me hungry, probably you too. So it's time to eat and go outside and up the stairs, or there's an elevator around the corner, and there's a dining room upstairs. The midshipmen who are here, please eat. you're welcome to eat. We have enough food. And we'll meet back here at 1:25. So have a good lunch.